Hello and welcome. So today we're going to be looking at natural monopolies. So we've looked at monopolies, we've had a look at some exam questions, we're going to have a look at a 25 marker later this week, but today we are going to be looking at natural monopolies. Now these are different to theoretical monopolies and they're different to 25% of the share, kind of like legal monopolies. So even when you have a theoretical monopoly where you've got one firm that has 100% of the market share, it may well not be a natural monopoly because a natural monopoly is completely different. So a natural monopoly is where you have, where the most efficient outcome of the market for consumers and producers is to have one firm kind of servicing the whole of the market. So having one firm with 100% of the market share. So just because it is the most efficient outcome doesn't mean it happens that way, and we often see that firms that are, not firms, but industries that are natural monopolies actually have some kind of niche markets within them with firms and kind of small areas of the market that are used kind of where there are some small pockets of competition, but the majority of the market is actually the efficient outcome is to have one firm. And the idea is that, if there were two firms, if we were to introduce competition to the market, if we were to have more than one firm in the market, that introduction of competition would actually increase costs for the firm and therefore push prices up for the consumer. So actually the outcome for the consumer and the producer is worse by the introduction of competition. And we're going to have a look at, I'm going to use one example, and then at the end of this, we're using all the information that we've got, you're going to come up with some examples on your own. So the example that I'm going to use is the water company. So if you think about Thames Water, if you think about whatever water company there is in your local area, they're the only one. And I want you to kind of think about why potentially. So you maybe pause this video and think about the water company and think about why that seems like a natural monopoly. Like it would be inefficient to have more than one water provider in your local area. So we can think about the fact that with a water company, what makes two water companies inefficient is a really important question. Well, there you have to think about cost, and that leads us very nicely on to our next part. So when we think about the water company, the fixed cost of creating a water company is incredibly high. So if you think about creating an infrastructure, finding a water source, treating that water, making sure that it meets all the regulatory guidelines, then also distributing that water through a network around an area. So you have to lay the pipes, you have to make sure that you have a system that's reliable, that isn't going to fail, because could you imagine what would happen if people turned on the taps with no water? That's also easy to be monitored, and that infrastructure can be maintained. That is an incredibly high fixed cost. And then when we compare that to the marginal cost, actually the marginal cost is incredibly low. So adding, if you build up a new housing network, if you think about maybe near where you live, or kind of when you drive around, you see these brand new houses kind of being built. Well, is it difficult to add another user, so an additional user, and a marginal cost of adding one more user to the network, so adding an extra house, is actually very minimal because you only have to kind of hook up that small area to the already existing infrastructure. So when we think about the water company, we can already see that the fixed costs are incredibly high, and actually the marginal cost is incredibly low and actually almost continuously falling. We'll have a look at that in a moment. So if we think about maybe the introduction of some kind of competition within that market, so let's think about what would happen if there were two water companies, for instance. Well, if there were two water companies, then there would have to be two networks, and in each individual house would have to decide which one of those networks that they would use. Would they use company A that has its entire infrastructure and company B that has its entire infrastructure? Well, that would mean that every single house has to have access to both of those infrastructures. Now that's an incredible cost, and then if that house didn't choose to use one of those firms, both firms would still have to maintain all the pipework, the infrastructure, make sure it's safe, make sure it's accessible, just in case. So actually having two firms is going to push up the prices for both firms, because those who are using one of those firms are going to have to supplement the infrastructure costs and the maintenance cost of all the people who aren't using that infrastructure, that firm's infrastructure, and they're using the other firm's infrastructure, and vice versa with the other firm as well. So actually having two sets of pipelines, two sets of infrastructure, all of that actually increases costs for both firms, and therefore consumers will also have to pay more as well. So when we introduce that competition, we can see that actually prices have increased for both the producers, but also, and therefore, for the consumers as well. So the fixed costs are extremely high, creating that infrastructure, maintaining that infrastructure, making sure it's safe and up to guidelines. We'll have a look at that in a moment, but that's an incredibly high. But actually, the marginal, once you've kind of incurred that cost and increase it, the marginal costs are very, very low, and we'll have a look at the impact of that when we draw this diagram here. So your long run average costs are falling continuously, right? Because you have a huge range of output, like a huge range of kind of quantity that you are producing, and over time your average costs are going to be continuously falling. Now your average costs are continuously falling because your marginal cost is also continuously falling. Now remember when we learned about marginal cost and average cost, if your marginal cost is falling and is below, well, even just if it's falling, then your average cost has to be falling, right? So therefore, because your output is so large, because your marginal cost is falling over time, then therefore your long run average cost has to be falling. And we're going to have a look at this on our diagram. So the AR and the MR doesn't really have a set rule for a natural monopoly. You could assume that by the nature, say for instance water, and we'll have a look at some other examples, we could maybe consider, because like water has no substitutes, that it's going to be an incredibly inelastic demand. Remember, the more substitutes that you can think of a product, then the more elastic the demand curve is going to be for the firm in the market. Now if you think about water, there's no real substitute, so therefore it's going to be an incredibly inelastic demand. But that's not necessarily true for all natural monopolies, and when we look at some examples we can see that actually the AR and MR may well be kind of less, because there are other substitutes in the market, so it might be less inelastic, more elastic. But I'm going to just kind of draw this as a unilateral, like not unilateral, but kind of standard AR and MR, kind of down here. And actually our AR and MR is the least of our concerns with this. It's not really so much what's important. What's really important is that our long run average costs are continuously falling. So normally we'd have that traditional like this, and we'd be looking at our kind of short run average cost, but here we're going to be looking at our long run average costs, and then we're going to look at our long run marginal cost as well. So firstly we're going to have a look at our long run marginal cost, because then that will help us see the shape of our long run average cost. So think about, like I said, once you've set up your infrastructure, you're going to be adding new people to the water kind of network and the water kind of infrastructure that already exists. So adding one additional house to that infrastructure that already exists is not actually going to cost the firm that much, and actually it's going to fall over long periods of time. So we're going to have a marginal cost, long run marginal cost, that's going to look like this, right? So this is going to be our long run marginal cost. And then because our long run marginal cost is falling, our long run average cost is also going to be falling. So our long run average cost is going to also look like this. So this is our long run average cost. And then the same rules apply, so we're going to find where our AC, our long run marginal cost, is equal to our long run, our marginal revenue, which is here. And hopefully what we can see is that the quantity that we're producing is a lot. So like in natural monopolies, they can produce a huge amount. The quantities that they're producing is actually quite a lot, and they're able to make a huge amount of supernormal profit because of their falling costs. Now, our long run average cost is just a mapping of our short run average cost. So actually we can go even further here, and I can kind of illustrate that for you. So you've been drawing your kind of short run average cost, but here you're just looking at like, they're going to be like this, kind of all the way along, and you're just kind of mapping over time. And you can see here that for a natural monopoly, this is going to be falling. I apologise for my on-the-fly poor diagram here, but you know. So we just map our kind of short run average costs along here, which is probably more up like that. And that should help us build the picture of our long run average costs. So we can see here that this firm and any natural monopoly actually ends up being able to produce a huge amount, and then they make a huge amount of supernormal profit. Now, whether they're actually able to make and charge this price, so this price here would obviously be their profit maximizing price. Now, not everybody who is a natural monopoly actually ends up being able to charge their profit maximizing price, and you might want to pause and just start to think about why that might be true. So why do you think that they aren't able to charge their profit maximizing price? Well, those of you who said CMA or regulation, you're absolutely right. Let's think about the nature of this good. So for instance, water companies, and when we have a look at some of the other examples that we've got here, you'll be able to see that they're selling necessities. They're selling goods that are incredibly inelastic in demand, especially if you think about water. You know, we live in an economy in the UK where the whole world would agree that water is a human right, and therefore the cost of water should be as low as possible. But you still want to introduce some form of kind of supernormal profit for the firm so that they can reinvest in dynamic efficiency, but also so that they can make a profit, keep their shareholders happy, and be able to sustain the system as well. So it's a really fine line and a really kind of awkward and quite a difficult balance that the competition authority has to do, and each one of these kind of areas that have an incredibly inelastic demand and are a necessity have their own regulator as well. Actually, if you decide to work in microeconomics long term and become a microeconomic kind of economist as a job, you may well end up working in regulation. It's where a lot of microeconomists tend to find themselves. So this firm is still a profit maximizer naturally, like they want to be a profit maximizer. Whether they are able to actually produce at their profit maximizing position and charge their profit maximizing price is a completely different ball game. That's completely up to if it was a natural monopoly with no government intervention. This is what the market would look like. Well, this is what the firm would look like, and therefore the market, because it's a natural monopoly. But because we have a lot of government regulation, and we'll see the impact of that when we look at government intervention in September. So what I would like you to think about now is starting to think about some examples. So what examples can you come up with of natural monopolies that fit into all of this here? So write them down, pause the video, have a go, think of as many as you can. There are quite a lot. So we know that there is a huge amount of S&P potential to be made. The output is very large, the supernormal profit is huge, and therefore we know that they're very regulated, not by the CMA necessarily. If it was a natural monopoly within like some industries, it may be the CMA, but it may well be like Ofqual or Ofwat or, you know, like kind of one of those government regulatory boards. And those, because of the nature of a lot of natural monopolies, because they deal with, and we'll go through some examples in a moment, but like say for instance water companies, like localised water companies, or the national grid for instance for electricity, because they're so important to our infrastructure, they're so important to our everyday life, and they're so important for kind of human basic necessity, they tend to be run by the government. We'll have a look at that in kind of like a few minutes time, but I'm just going to run through some examples that you may well have come up with, and I hope that you do come up with. So the first one is rail networks. Now that is not the trains, it's the actual physical infrastructure of the network that trains run on, right? So that is a natural monopoly. The infrastructure, the rail lines, maintaining the rail lines, building the rail lines, making sure that the rail lines are kind of, that infrastructure is maintained to a certain standard, is actually a natural monopoly. The national grid, so the electricity grid that you see, like that should spring to mind as a natural monopoly, because the infrastructure of creating that, the fixed costs are so incredibly high. But actually hooking up a house to the national grid is actually incredibly cheap. So the fixed costs of creating and maintaining are quite high, but actually the marginal costs are very low. Letter sorting, so this is an example, so I don't mean delivering necessarily, though potentially historically I do mean delivering, but not in today's day and age. But letter sorting, so what I want you to think about is when you're physically posting a letter, so if I want to go and post a letter, then I just walk to the post box and literally post it in. So that is the aspect of Royal Mail that is a natural monopoly. Could you imagine having like two sets of post boxes and deciding which company you want to post your kind of letter into the post box and seeing what happens, and you'd have to have the same amount of people but for different firms go around and empty all of those post boxes for all the different companies. It's actually much easier to have one firm, Royal Mail, going around and collecting those resources and those letters. Now, letter delivery is slightly different. That we've seen that it's become more contestable. We've seen that there's actually that market is opened up through technology. We've now got FedEx and parcel sourcing, and even Amazon has their own logistics firm. And actually Amazon set up this is an interesting fact, so Amazon set up their own logistics firms in retaliation for Royal Mail because they didn't want to pay the Royal Mail costs of parcel delivery, so they literally set up Amazon Logistics purely as their own firm to deliver all their parcels in the UK because they didn't want to deal with Royal Mail. TfL, so Transport for London, could you imagine having two sets of tube lines going exactly the same way, basically having one tube line and one tube network on top of another tube network, and you get to decide which one you go to? I mean, it would just be so inefficient and so costly for everybody involved. So instead we have one, it's a natural monopoly, and there are arguments when we have a look at the rest of the country as well. We've seen that actually if we compare real prices to kind of a nationalised natural monopoly system that we had previously to kind of pre-Margaret Thatcher to now, actually the real cost has risen and provision has fallen. It's a really interesting area if you want to have a look at it. And obviously we've said that water providers have used that as an example throughout. So some of these are... Obviously the Royal Mail used to be nationalised, but it was privatised in, I want to say, off the top of my head, 2010? I might be a year or two out, but I think it was privatised in 2010. The National Grid and the rail networks and water providers, I think they're all nationalised still, just the provision of the rail network, though actually, let me check on that and I'll put it in the description as to whether that's true or not. But I know that water providers are slightly private, and the National Grid itself is a natural monopoly as well. So if they are privatised, then they will have a usually have a regulatory board. So they will have a government regulation on them that introduce things that we'll have a deeper look at later on. Things like profit caps, to make sure that they are doing exactly what they do. They're not taking advantage of consumers on goods that they have a right to have and that they have a need, a basic human need, to be able to have access to things like electricity and water as well. So, natural monopolies, we're going to have another video looking at natural monopolies as well. We're going to have a look at the kind of long-term impacts of natural monopolies. We'll have a look at potentially an exam question looking at natural monopolies, or we'll look at how you can use natural monopolies when we look at a Monopoly 25 market. So I hope that has been interesting for you, and I hope that you have learned a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next lesson. Bye!